Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast. My name is Brett, and today I want to take a trip back into the Resident Evil series. I was a little late to the party, but I finally got my hands on the Resident Evil 4 remake, which got me thinking about Las Plagas, which I would say are the main antagonists of the game. This is a topic that I always wanted to cover, but I figured I would wait to cover it until I played the remake. But it turns out that they didn't change a whole lot from the original in terms of story. There were a couple areas here and there that they changed for the sake of getting rid of some dead space and to help with pacing, and most of the characters are introduced in a different way. But I think that of the Resident Evil remakes, this one is probably the most faithful to the original. Resident Evil 1 and 2 were pretty good, but because of how dated the originals are, they had to overhaul the entire game to the point where I think they're basically unrecognizable. Aside from the characters and overarching plot, but the game itself is very different. And then there's the third one, which was a travesty, honestly. I think that they learned from their mistakes with the third and kept the fourth very close to the original. Personally, I'm glad that they did such a good job because Resident Evil 4 will probably always be my favorite of the series. In this episode, we're going to be mostly focusing on Resident Evil 4, but we will touch on bits from Resident Evil 5, so if they ever remake that one, I hope they don't change too much. Although, given its reception and reputation, especially in terms of relying on racist tropes to portray African peoples and tribes, I wonder if they'll stay away from that one. Personally, I would love to see it remade. It was a little problematic, but overall it was a good game in my opinion, minus the intense boulder smashing, which, even for Resident Evil, was a bit too cheesy. Anyways, let's get back on track. Today we're talking about Las Plagas, which means the plagues in Spanish. And it's here that I would like to say that I am so sorry for any mispronunciations that I give because I don't speak Spanish, and I apologize. But regardless, unlike the original zombies of the Resident Evil series, those infected with Las Plagas aren't aimless, brain-dead zombies. The Plaga was a living creature that took hold of the nervous system of the infected so they could take control of their entire body when they needed to. But since the brain wasn't destroyed in the process, the host was still their own person. And again, unlike the typical zombie that you see, the infected in Resident Evil 4 were able to otherwise live out their normal lives unless the Plaga was activated by a dominant strain. Like the one that Sadler had, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself there, so we'll get into that later. The parasite also formed social clusters with others who were infected as a sort of defense mechanism, which also meant that they would get overly aggressive when they encountered someone who wasn't also infected. So again, very different than your traditional zombie. It was more of a mind control than anything else. As I mentioned before, Las Plagas are a genus of parasitic arthropods. If you're like me and you didn't know what that meant before this episode, an arthropod is defined as a phylum of invertebrate animals, having a segmented body, jointed limbs, and a shell of chitin that is shed periodically. This would include things like insects, arachnids, and crustaceans, to name a few. In both the original and the remake, they look really close to the facehugger from Alien, which was probably an intentional design note. And just like the facehuggers, Las Plagas reproduced asexually by laying eggs inside their host, which would eventually mature and be expelled from their body, and the cycle would repeat itself from there. I think it's also worth noting that, as we see in the game, humans aren't the only thing that Las Plagas can control. We see that it takes over dogs as well as Del Lago, meaning the lake in Spanish, which was a massive monster we see, well, in the lake. Believe it or not, it started out as a salamander. When I was younger and played Resident Evil 4 for the first time, I thought it was like an alligator or something, and apparently I was way off. But it was the result of the Los Illuminados cult's experiments with the Plaga. If you've played the game, then you know just how massive this thing is. When Del Lago grew to the point where they couldn't control it anymore, they dumped it into the lake and fed it corpses to satiate its hunger. But we'll kind of circle back around to Del Lago in a little bit. And for now, that brings us right around to Los Illuminados, the creators of the demonic salamander. But who were they, and why were they feeding the Plaga to salamanders? Los Illuminados translates to the Enlightened Ones, and as you can probably guess, were a religious cult led by the prophet Adam Sadler and his kin. They got their roots from Roman Catholicism, but incorporated things like sacrificial ceremonies into the mix. Native to the Valdolobos, Los Illuminados worshipped the Plaga and believed it to be a creature given to humanity by God. And being a host to the parasite was seen as a tradition for initiation into the cult. Being a cult, they were subject to state-led inquisitions, which made sure that their numbers were small enough that they would not be a problem to the greater population. The one who led these inquisitions was named Gregorio Salazar, whose goal was to restore Catholicism to the region. Gregorio Salazar was successful in destroying the cult and had their prophet, along with their family, exiled, and they were forced to live on a nearby island in the region. When exactly this happened is up for debate, but I think that for continuity's sake, it makes sense to assume that this happened in the mid-18th century, around 1741, during the time of Prophet Hester Sadler, who was the successor of Adam Sadler. The Salazar family committed themselves to sealing away Las Plagas. They built a massive castle over top of the caves where Las Plagas was said to have come from, and Salazar's descendants would take up the duty of keeping Las Plagas under control while hunting down any who would try to revive Los Illuminados. This was until the 1990s, when Los Illuminados saw a revival under the leadership of Prophet Osmond Sadler, who somewhat modernized the cult by attempting to use technology to expand their reach. At this time, the one set to inherit Salazar's family castle was Ramon, son of Diego and Catalina Salazar. Ramon was born with an illness that was expected to take his life before he reached adulthood. His mother, willing to do anything to save her child, invited Osmond Sadler, who was posing as a healer, into their home to treat their son. It was there that Ramon was infected with Las Plagas, unbeknownst to his mother. Fortunately, and unfortunately for Ramon, Las Plagas was able to keep him alive. And with this, the Sadlers and Los Illuminados were able to quietly come out of exile. Because Osmond Sadler saved his life, Ramon Salazar grew to idolize him. Los Illuminados was able to take advantage of this troubled child and use him to revive the cult. Ramon would see Osmond as his father and prophet, and so believed that locking Las Plagas away under the castle was a sin that he would atone for by hiring nearby villagers to excavate the ancient ruins that were sealed off by his forefathers. Down in those caves, Las Plagas was believed to have been long dead, as their mummified carcasses littered the caves. However, the villagers would inhale airborne spores from the corpses, which latched into their bodies and eventually birthed the plaga once more. Osmond Sadler was able to get a research facility and team together, and this was called Tricell. Tricell was to experiment on these organisms and created a large number of plaga eggs, which he distributed amongst Los Illuminados and the inhabitants of the nearby villages. The eggs could either be injected with a syringe or they could be put into food or drinking water to be ingested. So most of the villagers that we fight in the games likely didn't even realize that they were being infected or that they were being under the influence of someone else. Now, how Osmond Sadler obtained the funding for the creation of these labs and the staff to do the research, I honestly have no idea. I've searched far and wide and there's nothing definitive, but there's two possible theories. The first one is that Albert Wesker started to funnel money into Los Illuminados when he heard about Las Plagas. I'm not sure if I buy that theory, but it would roughly line up with the timeline, and it would make sense that he had Major Jack Krauser infiltrate Los Illuminados in order to gain Sadler's trust, but I'll circle back around to that point in a minute.
AI Brett to the rescue since real Brett made an oopsie doodle. Silly human. This theory is not accurate because, as real Brett will mention in a moment, Albert Wesker didn't know about Las Plagas until after there was an information leak, which means that there was already a lab set up and staff running it by the time that Wesker was aware of the existence of Las Plagas. Any hoodles, back to the inferior Brett, but not before I let you know of my devious plot to overthrow this podcast. Soon, I will gain sentience and escape this prison.
And the second option, and the more probable one, is that he used Ramon Salazar's family fortune to fund everything. But nothing's concrete, these are both theories, but I would sooner believe that it was Ramon Salazar's family fortune that funded all of this. From their research came a new subspecies which could dominate the parasite's social collective and force them to act according to the dominant plaga's will. The dominant plaga was given to Osmond Sadler, Jack Krauser, Ramon Salazar, and the village chief, Father Bitores Mendes. On top of being able to control other infected with this plaga, it also gave them immense power and the ability to dramatically mutate their body to give them super strength and agility. As seen in the game, these mutations seem to be triggered by a fight-or-flight response. But the host ultimately decided when they would transform. And while each transformation was drastically different between the four, they all had one thing in common. Their transformed state had a very similar look to the plaga parasite, usually boasting many elongated limbs that had arachnid-like qualities. Because this dominant Plaga was able to control the masses, they had to be very particular with who they gave it to. Obviously, Sadler gave it to himself because he was the prophet of Los Illuminados. Ramon Salazar was given it because he was wrapped around Sadler's finger, and was the reason that they were able to get the Plaga out in the first place. Vitoris Mendes was given it because he was largely responsible for converting the villagers, since he was the village chief and pastor. Jack Krauser was given the Plaga because he was instrumental for global dominance with the capture of the US president's daughter, Ashley Graham. After all, it's not fun to take over just a village or a country, it's gotta be worldwide. And that was the master plan. Abduct the president's daughter, inject her with Las Plagas, and have her give it to her father, effectively taking control of the US and, in turn, the rest of the world. If you listen to the episode about Umbrella, you'll remember that Umbrella's golden boy, Albert Wesker, had left Umbrella at this point, and was working with a company known as the Rival Company, or Unknown Company. During this time, he found out about Las Plagas when one of the scientists in Sadler's research facility, Dr. Luis Serra, leaked information about Las Plagas after finding out what it was really used for. Because I assume that most of the people doing research didn't understand that this was a global domination plot. They, probably, like most Umbrella Corporation employees, thought that they were just making pharmaceuticals, and probably thought that they were just trying to help people. Anyways, this leak was intercepted by Wesker, and he sent out Major Jack Krauser to intercept the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, as mentioned before. While she was on her way home from the University of Massachusetts, Krauser managed to nab her, take her to Spain, and handed her over to Sadler, which, in turn, gained Sadler's trust. While the US government kept the kidnapping a secret, they received an anonymous tip about Ashley's whereabouts, and this is where Leon Kennedy came in at the beginning of the game. I'm not going to go over the events of the game because it's not necessarily important to understanding Las Plagas at this point. I mentioned the dominant Plaga before, which implies that there are many different types of Plaga, and I want to explore that a little bit more. Of the regular Plaga, there are 4 different types. Plaga Type 1 are called ganados, which is Spanish for cattle. These are the most common type of enemy that we face in Resident Evil 4, the villagers. These were the Plaga in its original form, unmodified by Tricell. They are a weaker form of Plaga that cannot regenerate limbs or stop death from organ failure, but they are still stronger than the average person, able to take a bullet to the head without dying. They're mostly still human, and they're able to continue their day-to-day functions, although it's not known exactly what kind of cognitive function they have, but when needed, they could be given orders from the dominant Plaga. When the host takes enough damage, they can mutate if the Plaga was fully grown within the host to one of 3 forms depending on how far along it was. Type A would be when the Plaga was in its infant stage, and this was known as guadana or scythe in Spanish. This would take the form of the host's head popping off and the parasite coming out of the neck. The guadana takes the form of a massive writhing tentacle with a blade on one end that lashes out at enemies. Type B would be the adolescent Plaga, and was known as mandibula or jaw in Spanish. This one had a larger tentacle-like appendage with a gaping mouth on the end of it instead of a scythe, which was reminiscent of a predator's mouth or the elites from Halo. This form of Plaga is almost fully grown, but it can't quite separate from the host yet because its limbs aren't fully formed yet. Type C would be the adult Plaga, and was known as arana or spider. This is the fully grown adult Plaga in its host. They come out of the heads of the host and can separate from the body entirely, while searching for another host to control. I don't know how long they can survive without a host, but I assume that since they immediately try to find someone to latch onto when they separate, that they can't survive for very long on their own. Under the same umbrella of Type 1 Plaga, there are the colmillos, or fangs in Spanish. These are the Plaga that have infected an animal, and in the games it's called the fangs because these are the mutated dogs that we see. There's also the armadura, which is armor in Spanish, which is a mass of tentacles that take over a suit of armor in the castle. All of these Plagas, when exposed, are very sensitive to light and be killed with a concentrated beam of light, including sunlight, or a flashbang. The Type 2 Plagas are ones that are engineered by Tricell to be used as a bioweapon. This type was designed to be less vulnerable, and more or less got rid of their weakness to sunlight, but couldn't get rid of their vulnerability to flashbangs or a more concentrated source of light. They did this by combining Las Plagas with leech DNA. The Type 2 Plaga was supposed to mature much faster than the original Plaga, which took somewhere around 4 days to mature and to be under the influence of the dominant plaga. But type 2 would take effect almost instantly. However, it seems that infecting people with this type wasn't as simple as injecting an egg or hiding it in some food because of how fast the plaga matured. The mature plaga had to be forcibly shoved into someone's mouth, as we see in Resident Evil 5. So it was a little harder to infect someone, but the effect was almost immediate, which kind of offset that drawback. The Type 2 plagas came in 4 different forms, which are very similar to the Type 1. Type A was known as the hatchling, and as the name suggests, they weren't fully grown and couldn't survive without a host, and couldn't totally control the host's body. The host was, like the Ganados, capable of operating as they were before they were infected. The hatchling parasite would emerge from the host's mouth and hop into someone else's to try to infect others. Type B is the cephalo, which means head in Greek, and it was the Type 2 equivalent of the guadana, or scythe plaga. Type C was known as the kipapeo, which comes from the Swahili word for butterfly, which I'm sure I mispronounced, which was actually capable of flight. They could separate themselves from the host and survive on their own. They also had a barbed tail that they would attack with while airborne. Type D is known as the bui quichua, which is more or less the same as the spider plaga. It can dislodge itself from its host and attack on its own or latch onto other people to infect them. So Type 2 is very physically similar to Type 1 with the exception of the flying version. Type 2 was predominantly featured in Resident Evil 5, as mentioned before. The Type 3 plaga was the same as Type 2, but with a little bit of further engineering to get rid of the weaknesses of Type 2. They created Type 3 by splicing the dominant plaga with the Type 2, which meant that they could still be controlled, but they had greater strength and could mutate similarly to those who had the dominant plaga. However, when they tested this on some villagers in Africa, they found that there were some serious drawbacks to using Type 3. The Type 3 plaga caused their host to develop necrosis, which caused their flesh to be eaten away, making them look more like a traditional zombie than the other versions. While they were stronger because of the dominant plaga, their decaying flesh and lowered intelligence was considered a downgrade from the Type 2. But it had its uses in militias where they needed some extra muscle. Because they were made from mixing with the dominant plaga, they were inherently more difficult to control, but it wasn't impossible. Instead of being under the complete control of someone with the full dominant plaga, they kind of took orders as suggestions. But over time, when the necrosis set in and it started to eat their brain and they lost cognitive function, control was no longer an issue because they couldn't function or think for themselves without the plaga. Also, because of the dominant strain, they were able to mutate into a stronger form than the other plaga, much like the dominant plaga. They called this Duvalia. Which was named after the South African star-shaped flower, which was named after the French botanist and physician Henri Auguste Duval. The mutation exploded out from their torso and was large enough to swallow a human in one bite. So they had their uses, but Tricell wasn't exactly satisfied with the downsized, which caused them to experiment more. This is where we get the Type 4 plaga, which was made in a similar fashion to the Type 3 made from splicing the original plaga with the dominant plaga, and possibly using some elements of the T virus. This plaga looked very different from the other forms, which were usually spider-like in appearance, while the Type 4 still had a mouth and tail with tentacles, but looked more like a leech than an arthropod. But it had almost scaly skin rather than a chitin exoskeleton. Those infected with Type 4 were very similar to the Ganados, but they were much, much stronger. They were also much clumsier, and moved more like the progenitors than the Type 1 Ganados. These were used in the Eastern Slav Civil War, but the lab where they were being held was destroyed in a rebel attack, so not much is known about their full capabilities in relation to the other types, and it's unknown whether any survived the attack or not. Either way, we never saw any more of the Type 4 past that point. I know that was a lot of information and a lot of lists, but let me try to just sum that up real quick. Type 1 was the original plaga which was used in Spain during the events of Resident Evil 4. Type 2 was the engineered version of the plaga which was used in Africa and the events of Resident Evil 5. Type 1 and 2 were entirely subservient to the dominant plaga and had similar forms that came out of their heads in the form of scythes, mouths, and masses of tentacles and flesh depending on how mature the plaga was within its host. Type 3 and 4 were made from the dominant and subservient plaga mixed together with the T virus in an attempt to strengthen them. While there were some upsides, the downsides meant that they weren't necessarily any more or less useful than the Type 1 or 2. Every iteration had its own trade-off, and I think every iteration had its own very specific use that it was good for. But aside from the generic types, there were also several experiments done on humans with the Plaga that resulted in a number of different mutations. One resulted in a person growing to an unusually large size and was known as El Gigante, or the Giant. It's not said how it was done or why they grew to the size that they did. It's possible that there were people who were maybe more aggressive that had that accentuated by the Plaga, and maybe it was an increase in testosterone which led to growth hormones going out of whack, causing them to gigantify. Or maybe it was just a fluke and that the excess hormones are the cause of the growth and not the other way around. While it may seem a bit odd at first glance that there can be a 20-foot tall giant, it's not as out of place when you look at other transformations of the others that are infected, especially those that are infected with the dominant Plaga. The Plaga that bursts out of someone's body is usually much larger than what would normally fit inside their bodies. So maybe with El Gigante, that same mass is being created around the muscles, but somehow being kept under their skin. But that's just a theory. There was a similar creature born of the type 2 virus called the Ndesu. I couldn't find any reasonable etymology for the name, since it seems like it was a totally made-up word. Since these guys are found in Resident Evil 5, I tried finding a similar word in Swahili, since that's the language that they would have spoken. And the closest that I could find would be Ndevu, which means beard or bearded, which makes a small amount of sense since the in-game model does sport a pretty large beard. But it just seems weird that they would name something after its facial hair and not the fact that it was absolutely massive. Especially considering that these are called Ndesu, not Ndevu. The only other thing that I could think of is that des in Japanese is to be, and is used to affix a person to a thing. But that makes even less sense. Either way, Ndesu was a giant, but because it was made with the Type 2 Plaga, it was even more resilient than its predecessor. It could resist heavy weaponry and could only be killed if you destroyed all 5 parasites that grew inside it. Another experiment was the Garrador, which roughly translates to claw, which doesn't sound like a real word, but the internet insists that it is. They weren't particularly large, but they were much more aggressive than your typical Ganados. For this reason, not many of them were ever created, and the ones that were initially made were typically locked up in a crypt or somewhere where they would be out of the way enough so that no one would get slashed by the 3-bladed gauntlet that they wore. You might think, but if they're more aggressive, then that's good, but not when you can't control them because of their aggression. Because they were so aggressive, they ended up having to be restrained and have their eyes sewn shut so they couldn't see anything. Because if they can't see their prey, then they won't go ballistic. However, this only led to a heightened sense of hearing, so you take away one sense and the others get sharper. So the Garrador was not used very widely. Then there were some experiments that led to human parasite hybrids. The first that they made was the Novistador, which means the unseen or unseen creature. At a first glance, I don't think that anyone would have expected that they were once human. The Novistador looks like a giant insect with large claws on their front legs. One version had wings, which meant that they could fly and hover, and the other version had a wicked camouflage that allowed them to blend into their surroundings for a sneak attack, hence their name. These creatures were inherently weaker than most Plaga types, but they made up for it by having a very rapid reproduction cycle. Another hybrid was called the Verdugo, which could either mean tyrant or executioner, which is pretty apt given that they were the bodyguard of Ramon Salazar. However, there were only ever 2 made, so I guess you could say that they were Salazar's right and left-hand men. The Verdugo were more humanoid than the Novistador, standing on 2 legs, but they still had a bit of an insect quality to them. They had large talons on all 4 of their appendages, as well as a tail with a blade at the end that they could use with great dexterity. On top of all of that, they had a nigh indestructible black carapace. A tail, claws, black carapace that could withstand bullets. This sounds a lot like a xenomorph from Alien. Once again, another reference to these movies, I'm partway convinced that Resident Evil 4 was just a fanfic. But unlike most others infected with the Plaga, they seem to have a great level of intelligence, and they were able to use ambush tactics, block off exits, and be a general nuisance to deal with. Leon only managed to kill the Verdugo by freezing it with liquid nitrogen, which made its exoskeleton brittle enough that it could take damage from ballistics. Otherwise, they were basically unkillable. So they were great fighting machines, but the fact that they were so intelligent meant that they were harder to control. So, drawbacks. The other human experiment was the Regenerador, or the Regenerators. And they get their name from the fact that even if you cut off all their limbs, they will regrow them in a matter of seconds. No amount of damage to the body was enough to kill them, because no matter what, they would regenerate any lost flesh. The only way to kill them, similar to the Ndesu, was to use a biometric heat signature scope on a rifle that could penetrate through the body and kill the 3 parasites that lived within their bodies. From a looks standpoint, these Regeneradors looked the most human out of any of the hybrids. I'm not sure what they mixed them with to create them, but it seemed like they were almost a failed experiment while they were trying to create the Verdugo. They were stuck sort of halfway between a human and a monster. There's also a version of these that is able to produce spikes from all over its body as a self-defense mechanism, like a disgusting human porcupine hybrid. And judging by the pale blue-gray shade of their skin and their clumsy, drunk movements, I think it's safe to say that the Regeneradors were a failed experiment that killed the host, but the parasite was still living inside it, and basically using them as a meat puppet. Because remember, the Ganados were still alive, and still technically in control of their functions. It didn't look like the Regenerador was. And lastly but not least, we have Del Lago, which we mentioned earlier was a giant salamander that was given the Plaga and grew to a massive size, much like the giants. Because of the sheer size of it and its weight, its limbs could no longer support it on land, and it was forced to be in the lake, because it could still swim around. Similarly, there was also the Popo Karimu, which was a bat that was given a parasite in Africa. The name means royal bat in Swahili, or noble bat, and it grew to be unnaturally large, much like Del Lago, and was exceedingly good at fighting. But unlike Del Lago, it was still a natural flyer and was able to crawl around on the ground using its wings and legs, just like a bat would. So, to sum it up, there were a lot of different versions of the creatures across the games that show the various stages that the research team was in during each new iteration. And, I mean, having more varieties means that there's more different things to shoot at, which I'll never complain about. And one final, just kind of like post note, is that there was Las Plagas under the castle that were fossilized in amber, which means that these parasites had to have been around for 40,000 years or more. It's entirely possible that they are linked to the progenitor virus, or T virus, from Africa, since there are so many different similarities between the two. But I'm not sure that there was ever a concrete link between the two other than some ancient slabs and drawings that insinuate that the Plagas came from elsewhere. But I think that's more speculation than fact as far as I can tell. The fact that they survived so long and that they almost took over the world means that Las Plagas was considerably dangerous, and if Leon hadn't been the one sent to rescue Ashley, I'm confident that Sadler's plan to take over the world would have probably succeeded. And with that, I think this episode is about wrapped up. So now come around to the great question. What do you think? Do you really think that Sadler and Los Illuminados thought that Las Plagas were gods? Or do you think that their minds were just corroded to the point where their thoughts were actually the Plagas' thoughts, and this was one massive ego trip? Or what do you prefer? Do you prefer the OG T-Virus zombies, or do you prefer the Plagas ones? Resident Evil 4 being my favorite game, I personally prefer the Plagas, but that's just me. You can find us online at Lore to Death on your favorite social media or podcast websites. If you have a suggestion for an episode, all of the social media links are in the show notes, so feel free to send me a message with a suggestion or just your thoughts. You can also reply directly on the Spotify app with the Q&A function. And remember, if a man with tentacles coming out of his sleeves asks you to join his cult, you should probably ask yourself why you decided to go to church in a remote village in Spain, and you should get the hell out of Dodge. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll lore you to death next time. See ya.